The laughter had been real just moments before, warm, effortless, the kind that rolls easily through a room when people feel safe. The lights washed the stage in gold, the band stood ready, and the audience leaned back in their seats, relaxed, unguarded. It was supposed to be another taping like hundreds before it. Familiar rhythm, familiar joy. And then a little girl stepped forward. She was smaller than the microphone stand, her shoes slightly scuffed, her hands folded together as if holding on to courage she wasn't sure would last. She did not smile the way children are expected to on television. There was no performance in her eyes, only seriousness, only something far too heavy for someone her age to carry alone. Steve Harvey noticed immediately. Not because the cameras told him to, not because a producer whispered in his ear, but because after decades of standing under studio lights, he had learned to recognize the quiet signals, the way pain settles into posture, the way bravery looks when it's borrowed against fear. His smile softened, his body stilled. The room followed without realizing why. The girl spoke softly at first, her voice barely rising above the hum of the studio. Each word seemed carefully chosen, as if she knew there might not be another chance to be heard. The audience leaned forward. A few parents instinctively reached for their children's hands. Steve Harvey did not interrupt. He did not rush her. Time slowed in a way television rarely allows. As her story unfolded, the energy in the room shifted not sharply, but gently, like a curtain being drawn back. This was no longer entertainment. This was testimony. Something fragile and brave had stepped into the light, and everyone could feel it. You could sense the moment when it reached him. His eyes glistened, not from shock, but from recognition. He had heard many stories, too many, but this one carried a different weight, because it wasn't just about struggle. It was about urgency, about a child standing at the edge of circumstances she did not create and could not escape alone. The rules of the show were clear. They always were. Time limits, segments, schedules, boundaries designed to keep everything moving smoothly. Television survives on structure. Compassion often does not. Steve Harvey looked at the girl again, really looked, and something inside him broke open. The audience could feel it before they saw it. A tightening in the chest, a stillness so complete it bordered on reverence. This was the kind of silence that listens, the kind that understands instinctively that whatever comes next will matter long after the applause fades. Steve Harvey's voice wavered when he finally spoke, not because he lacked control, but because control had stepped aside for something truer. His hand came up to his face, as if surprised by the tears already there. The cameras did not cut away. They didn't need to. This was not a moment to edit. In that instant, the show stopped being a show. What followed would ripple far beyond that studio, beyond that day, beyond anything written into a production plan. A single decision, quiet, unscripted, deeply human, would open doors that had been closed to children just like her. Hundreds of them. Lives redirected not by policy or protocol, but by one man's refusal to let rules outweigh a child's need. But none of that was visible yet. All that existed was a little girl standing under lights that suddenly felt too bright, and a host who understood that sometimes the most important role a person can play is not entertainer, or judge, or authority, but protector. Steve Harvey took a breath, the kind that steadies a heart before it does something irreversible, because once compassion crosses a certain line, there is no going back. The little girl's name did not matter at first, not to the audience, not to the cameras. What mattered was the story she carried with her, folded carefully into a voice that had learned too early how to be brave. She came from a place most people never see unless they are forced to. A world shaped by missed meals and quiet fear, by nights when adults whispered worries meant to be hidden from children who heard them anyway. Her mother worked whenever work could be found, stitching together hours like scraps of fabric, hoping they would be enough to keep the lights on, hoping they would be enough to keep her daughter believing that life could still be kind. But kindness had been inconsistent. School had become a refuge and a reminder at the same time. A place where the girl learned to read, to dream, to imagine futures that felt impossibly far away. And also a place where hunger distracted her thoughts, where exhaustion weighed on her eyelids, where questions about home lingered unanswered. Teachers noticed. They always do. The quiet ones are often the loudest when you learn how to listen. There had been hospital visits too. Too many for someone so small. A condition that required care her family could not afford easily. Medication rationed. Appointments delayed. The kind of slow emergency that doesn't make headlines but changes outcomes all the same. The girl had learned the language of waiting rooms and clipped explanations, of adults speaking gently around truths they didn't know how to soften. When she was chosen to appear on the show, it felt unreal. A bright interruption in a life defined by endurance. Her mother had pressed her dress the night before, hands trembling slightly, unsure whether hope was something they could afford to feel. They had not come asking for sympathy. They had come because someone told them it might help. Because sometimes you say yes to miracles, even when you don't fully believe in them. Steve Harvey had not known the details when the segment was planned. He rarely did. He trusted the process. He trusted the people behind the scenes. But more than that, he trusted his instincts. And the moment the girl stepped forward, those instincts told him this was different. He saw his own children in her hesitation. Saw the way kids try to be strong for adults they love. Saw the unfair bargain childhood sometimes makes be brave now, so the world doesn't fall apart. The audience sensed it too. Parents felt their throats tighten. Grandparents shifted in their seats. Even those without children recognized the vulnerability standing before them. A child does not need to say much to be understood when the truth is written all over their posture. As the girl spoke more clearly, her story filled the space. Not dramatically, not with tears, just facts delivered carefully, as if she had practiced them in her head many times before. She spoke about her dreams, simple ones. Going to school without worry, helping her mom, feeling better, living long enough to grow into the person she imagined herself becoming. There was no self-pity in her words. That was what made them unbearable. Steve Harvey's breathing slowed. His shoulders dropped. He was no longer listening as a host. He was listening as a father, as a man who had known struggle, as someone who understood that systems are built for averages, not for children standing in front of microphones asking for a chance to live. The rules of the show had been designed for fairness, equal time, equal opportunity, equal outcomes within a narrow frame. But fairness, Steve Harvey knew, is not the same as justice. And justice, when it comes to children, does not wait for permission. Behind the cameras, producers exchanged glances. They could feel it too. The segment was stretching. The clock was moving. Schedules were slipping, but no one spoke. No one dared to interrupt what was unfolding naturally. The little girl finished speaking and stood very still, hands clasped again, eyes lifted just enough to meet Steve Harvey's gaze. She did not ask directly for help. Children like her rarely do. She simply told the truth and waited to see what it would do. That was when Steve Harvey felt the rules begin to loosen their grip. He had built his career within structures, networks, contracts, expectations, but none of them mattered more than the moment in front of him. None of them mattered more than a child whose future hinged on whether the world would respond with humanity instead of procedure. The audience waited, not impatiently, reverently. Steve Harvey swallowed, eyes still wet, and made a decision that would not stay contained within that studio. A decision that would reach far beyond one girl, one family, one day. He had not yet spoken the words, but in his stillness, everyone could sense it. Something was about to change. The moment did not announce itself with drama. It arrived quietly, in the space between Steve Harvey's breath and his next word. He looked down at the card in his hand, the one that told him how the segment was supposed to go, how long it should last, what was permitted, what was not. Then he looked back at the little girl, still standing too straight, as if posture alone could keep her world from tipping over. The audience watched him hesitate. Not the playful pause they knew so well, the one that set up a punchline. This was different. This pause carried weight. It pressed against the walls of the studio, heavy enough that even the cameras seemed to lean in. Steve Harvey lowered the card. He crouched slightly so he was closer to her height. Not to make a show of humility, but to meet her where she was. His voice, when he spoke, was gentle, steadying like someone placing a hand on a trembling shoulder. He asked one more question, not for the audience, not for television, for her. And when she answered, something in him broke fully open. The tears came without apology. They surprised him, and he did not hide them. He covered his mouth for a moment, shook his head as if trying to regain footing, but the emotion had already taken hold. The audience followed him there, eyes burning, hands rising to faces, hearts pounding in quiet unison. You could hear it then. Not applause, not music, just breathing. Hundreds of people breathing together, aware they were witnessing something that would not be replayed the same way twice. Steve Harvey straightened and turned slightly, not toward the cameras, but toward the producer's table. It was not a demand. It was a statement delivered calmly, resolutely, with the authority of someone who understood the cost of inaction. He said the rules were changing. There was a beat half a second, maybe less, where the world seemed to wait. And then, instead of resistance, there was acceptance, a nod, a quiet understanding that some moments outrank protocol. Steve Harvey returned his attention to the girl. He told her she was not alone anymore, that what she needed mattered, that people were listening now. His words did not promise miracles. They promised effort, commitment, follow-through, the kind of help that continues after the lights go out. The audience rose to its feet, not in celebration, but in solidarity. Applause rolled through the studio like a wave, not loud at first, then swelling as people stood, wiping tears, clapping through emotion that had nowhere else to go. But Steve Harvey wasn't finished. He spoke beyond her, beyond the room, to something larger. He talked about children who fall through cracks because cracks are convenient, about systems that move too slowly for young bodies fighting adult-sized battles, about how change often begins when someone decides that "that's not how we do things" is no longer an acceptable answer. What no one realized yet was that this was not a single exception. Behind the scenes, phones were already buzzing, contacts being pulled, foundations alerted, medical partners looped in, educational resources discussed. What started as one decision expanded rapidly, organically, as compassion found infrastructure. The little girl listened, eyes wide, trying to understand what was happening around her. Steve Harvey reached for her hand, not to pull her anywhere, but to anchor her, to let her know that this was real, that adults were stepping in, not stepping back. The lights felt softer then. Or maybe it was the way people were looking at one another, strangers connected by a shared willingness to care. By the time the segment ended, the show had transformed into something else entirely. Not charity as performance, not emotion as entertainment, but action sparked by presence. In the days that followed, the ripple would grow. Other children would come forward. Stories long buried would find voice. Rules would bend again, and again, and again, until bending became building. But in that moment, none of that was visible yet. There was only a little girl holding onto a man's hand, and a room full of people who had just been reminded that compassion, once chosen, does not stay small. What happened next did not feel like television anymore. It felt like something older, something human and unguarded. After the applause faded, Steve Harvey stayed with the little girl. Not because the cameras demanded it, but because leaving too quickly would have felt like abandonment. He spoke to her softly, words meant only for her, though the audience leaned in as if listening might somehow help her carry them. He told her she was brave, not in the way adults often say it to tidy up a child's pain, but in the way that recognizes courage without asking it to do more work. He told her that what she had shared mattered, that it had weight, that adults were now responsible for what they had heard. The girl nodded slowly, as if filing the words somewhere safe. Children like her learn early how to ration hope. She did not cry. Not yet. She simply held his hand tighter, grounding herself in the reality of touch. Steve Harvey turned the moment outward, but not upward. He did not perform generosity. He invited accountability. He spoke about what it means to show up after empathy, about how tears alone change nothing unless they are followed by action. The studio, once built for laughter, felt almost sacred, like a place temporarily repurposed for truth. You could sense the audience transforming from witnesses into participants. People were no longer watching a story. They were being written into it. Their applause carried intention now. Their stillness carried consent. This was a collective decision to care. Behind the scenes, plans solidified. Medical consultations scheduled, legal hurdles acknowledged and addressed, educational support mapped out. The rules that had once constrained the show were not merely bent, they were rewritten with purpose. What began as an exception quickly revealed itself as a blueprint. Steve Harvey did not frame it as saving anyone. He framed it as standing with someone. There is a difference. One elevates the helper. The other restores dignity to the helped. The girl's mother was brought forward, eyes wet with disbelief. Years of exhaustion softened into relief that felt almost dangerous to trust. She thanked him quietly, repeatedly, as if gratitude might anchor this moment in place. Steve Harvey thanked her back for trusting the room, for raising a child who could speak truth without bitterness. When the segment finally ended, the lights dimmed gently, as if respecting what had passed between them. People lingered in their seats. No one rushed for exits. The energy felt tender, like a shared understanding that something important had happened and that it deserved care, not commentary. In the days that followed, Steve Harvey stayed involved. Not publicly, not performatively. He checked in. He asked questions. He listened. He ensured that promises became processes and processes became outcomes. The girl received care that did not expire when attention moved on. She returned to school stronger, steadier, carrying the quiet confidence of someone who knows adults can be trusted at least sometimes. But the story did not stop with her. Other families came forward. Other children with similar needs, similar obstacles, similar courage. The same rules that had once excluded them were challenged again, then replaced. Partnerships formed. Resources expanded. What had been an exception became an initiative, then a commitment. Over time, more than 500 children found support because one child had spoken and one man had listened. Steve Harvey never claimed ownership of the outcome. He understood that compassion multiplies best when it does not insist on credit. He spoke less about the moment and more about the responsibility it revealed. That when platforms are used to amplify need instead of ego, they can become instruments of healing. Platform. For the little girl, the studio became a memory bright, overwhelming, kind. For Steve Harvey, it became a reminder that the most powerful rules are the ones we choose to change. And for everyone who witnessed it, whether in that room or from far away, the moment lingered like a question. What would happen if empathy were allowed to interrupt our routines more often? The answer had already begun to form. Time has a way of testing whether moments were real or just emotional weather passing through. This one endured. Months turned into years, and the little girl grew stronger, steadier, no longer defined by the urgency that once brought her under studio lights. Her life did not become perfect. Healing rarely works that way. But it became possible. She learned without the constant weight of fear pressing against her chest. She laughed more easily. She dreamed without immediately calculating the cost. And she was not alone. Because what Steve Harvey had changed that day did not quietly revert back when attention faded. The rules stayed different. The doors stayed open. The blueprint that compassion had sketched in real time was refined, funded, and repeated. More than 500 children, each with their own version of that quiet courage, found help because someone once decided that television could be more than timing and transitions. Some needed medical care. Others needed stability. Others needed nothing more complicated than to be seen long enough for the right people to step in. Their stories were not identical, but they were connected by a single truth. Systems move faster when empathy leads. Steve Harvey rarely spoke about numbers. He spoke about faces, about names he remembered, about letters written in careful handwriting, sent years later, saying thank you not for saving lives but for believing they were worth the trouble. The audience carried the legacy too. Viewers wrote in, not just with praise but with offers. Doctors volunteering time, educators opening classrooms, ordinary people asking how they could help the next child standing quietly at the edge of being overlooked. Compassion, once witnessed, had learned how to replicate itself. The studio where it all began went back to laughter, to games, to applause on cue, but something had shifted beneath the surface. A reminder etched into the walls that rules are only as sacred as the lives they serve. Steve Harvey continued his work, but with a deeper stillness when children stepped forward. A longer pause before moving on. He had seen what happens when listening is allowed to finish its work. And the little girl, once so small beside the microphone, became a quiet symbol of something the world often forgets. That change does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes in a soft voice, asking to be heard. Sometimes it comes in tears that refuse to be hidden. Sometimes it comes when one person decides that doing the right thing matters more than doing the expected thing. The moment did not save the world, but it saved a life, and then another, and another. Sometimes, television doesn't just entertain, it heals. If this story touched your heart, subscribe and share so the world never forgets moments like these. This is Stories Left Behind, where human stories are never lost.